Good afternoon, and welcome to another episode of Between the Pillars, the Fisher Library's video podcast series where we get to meet library staff, we get to meet library collections. My name is John Shoesmith. I'm the outreach librarian here at Fisher, and today is June 29th, and this is episode 15 of the second season of the podcast, and I should say the last one of this coming season. We're going to be taking a little bit of a break over the summer. We will be coming back to you in September, I promise. But for the time being, we're going to do one last episode prior to Canada Day. And we've deliberately chosen Canada Day as our theme because we are coming up to Canada Day on Friday. Even though we're showing this episode on the Wednesday, it's because we're closed both Thursday and Friday. So we'll be we're doing this special podcast for today, so a midweek special for you. So I just wanted to say it's been another great year for the podcast. This is our second season, and I was just going over some of the guests we've had on our playlist and some of the collections we've had and that we've profiled on the podcast, and it's really been kind of a fun year. We've had Fisher staff, we've had some outside folks, we had a couple of novelists that wrote about Fisher. Not quite Fisher, but sort of Fisher. We had a really special episode on our Ukrainian holdings, which was one of the most powerful ones we had just after the war started. So it's been a really great season. I anticipate next season is going to be just as good. We're going to have all kinds of different guests and profiling different collections. But what we wanted to do, as I said today, we're going to talk about Canada, and this is a perfect segue into introducing our very new staffer here at Fisher Library, Grant Hurley. Grant has only been here for the past month. We hired him toward the end of May, and he started in June. He's been on site pretty much for the last couple of weeks, learning his way around the collections, learning his way around the building. But Grant, one of the reasons why it was great to hire you and to have someone new on staff is because I've pretty much exhausted everybody else on staff for these Between the Pillars podcasts. So it's nice when I suggested to Grant that maybe he could appear on the podcast to both introduce himself and to talk about Canada Day. I should mention he didn't balk at all. He was actually quite keen and enthusiastic. So he's going to fit in very well at the Fishers. So welcome, Grant. Thanks for appearing on the last episode of the season and to talk about Canadiana. So let's talk a little bit about yourself first. You've kind of made sort of a coast-to-coast route to eventually end up in Toronto, which started, I think, on the East Coast. So maybe you can just give us a bit of your history and background prior to you coming to Fisher.
Yeah, and thanks so much for having me on the podcast, John. I've been a long time watcher, so first time contributor. Really honored to be here today. And really happy to talk about the role I'm so excited to start here at the Fisher as Canadiana Librarian. So
great.
Yeah, you're asking how did I get here? Where did I come from? I was born in Fredericton, New Brunswick. So that's where my family's from. On my dad's side, we have roots in New Brunswick going back to the Irish migrations from Ireland, as well as Acadian roots. And when I was a teenager, my family moved to an even smaller town in New Brunswick called St. Andrews, just right on the coast of the Bay of Fundy and Passamaquoddy Bay, Peshko-Dumukati territory. And that's where I really fell into just a love of Canadian history, Canadian literature, and working in archives. I was really, really lucky. As a teenager, my high school history professor said, I think you might be a good candidate to work as a summer student at the county archives. I hadn't heard of the place before. I didn't really know what it was.
Right.
But she saw something in me, I think, and I applied for the job and was successful, and showed up for work at this 19th century prison, which had been converted in the 70s into the local county archives for Charlotte County, New Brunswick. It was an incredible place. Like, it's sort of the kind of experience for me working in heritage institutions.
Right.
Beautiful collections of particularly photographs and other records about the history of the region, reference collections too about local history, and then just always something new happening, kind of like this place. Like, being back here is reminding me of that. Like, always somebody interesting coming through the front doors with interesting questions, and matching their excitement with the collections. It was such a thrill for me, and it's sort of what drew me into the field.
So she probably sensed you have a archival and library nerdishness about you. How about that?
So,
And I say that as a compliment.
yeah, there's a type, right? But it was a wonderful introduction to the field. I was mentored by some really great archivists at that kind of archives.
Right.
And sort of around that time too, I had a really strong interest in Canadian literature. And so I followed that path for a while, studying CanLit. So through my undergrad at Mount Allison University, I studied early Canadian children's literature, often because I'd found a lot of that material like at yard sales in my hometown, all these old Canadian books.
Right.
I sort of felt like nobody had ever really talked about them in great detail. And I was interested in what they had to say about, being a citizen in Canada in the 19th and early 20th centuries. And so I studied that. And then the sort of coast to coast thing was that I went out to UBC for a master's degree in English. Okay. So continued to pursue that interest. And I'll talk about that more as we go along here, just because that's been sort of a research interest that's really stayed with me. But, I just piled school upon school. Like when grad school is a great way to see the rest of Canada. And so moving out to UBC and living there was a wonderful experience for somebody who's only really known the Maritimes.
In terms of then going to UBC, was that kind of a deliberate choice? Was the program of interest to you? Was it something that you just wanted to maybe try another coast?
Well, it's funny you mentioned that. So I had initially had every intention of going to McGill. Montreal is sort of like the most logical place for a New Brunswick person to go if they want to go to a big city. It's like Halifax is relatively large, but Montreal is like the real city. That's nearby. So it seemed like the logical destination.
You weren't ready for Toronto then?
No, that would have been like impossible for me. Coming to Toronto would have been just a little too much. Like the town I grew up in New Brunswick doesn't have any like stoplights. It's small. There's 1,800 people that live there year round.
No streetcars.
Very cosmopolitan in other ways, but yeah, not in terms of infrastructure. So, Montreal was sort of the choice, but it ended up, I'd applied to UBC on the recommendation of a professor of mine and an undergrad who said, there's some good people there doing interesting things in the English department. So I applied and then got just a much better offer in terms of funding, in terms of sort of the like welcoming aspect. Like they wrote a really kind admission letter. And I thought, why not? Let's try out another part of Canada. I'd never been there before. I'd never set foot east or west, of Alberta by that point.
Right.
And then, showed up on a plane and just kind of settled into Vancouver, but I loved it. I lived there for 5 years.
So your studies at UBC, were they centered around CanLit? Were they centered around Canadian history or?
Yeah, and I'll tell the story of my master's thesis at UBC in a minute, sort of as part of this, because the story is fun. Like there's more to it. But over the course of my time there, I met my wife, Christina, in the English program at UBC. And then we kind of split off. So she stayed in academia insofar as like study, like this formal study of literature. And I decided to go back to school for more for library and archival studies at UBC.
Right, because you wanted a job. Like many of us that thinking about, okay, what kind of graduate degree can I get where I might be able to get a job afterward?
I think for me, it was like in New Brunswick, I paid $375 a month for rent. And then going to Vancouver, I was like, oh, I think I need an income. Right. But the big part of it really was that my mentor at the Charlotte County Archives in New Brunswick had gone to the UBC program, and she had mentioned it to me as an option. And sort of as I was nearing the end of my English degree, I remembered all that fun that I'd had in St. Andrews at the county archives, and thought like, no, this is actually, I think, more in line with what I want to do with my life, my working life, and because the program was there and it had been already recommended to me, I applied and was lucky enough to get in.
And they have a particularly strong archival program, don't they?
They do, yeah. And that's sort of what I had been there for. But I decided you have the option there of doing a library degree on top of that as well. So, being somebody who loves being in school, I just piled on another degree on top of that. It meant that I could stay in Vancouver a bit longer too. And yeah, it was good actually having that dual focus, because it's meant that I can come to a place like the Fisher and be able to work with archival materials and with library materials and have an understanding of vocabulary and approaches to both. So it was a good choice, even though it felt like too much at the time.
And interesting enough, I mean, Grant probably remembers this, is that just pre-pandemic, we were actually planning a joint exhibition together. If you remember correctly, because Grant is a member of the Alcuin Society, and he had pitched an exhibition that would be outside of the Fisher doors that would highlight some of the winners of the past of that year's Alcuin Society Design Awards, and I was going to curate a small little exhibition inside Fisher to kind of show the history of some of those books that have been awarded design awards. Maybe you can talk about maybe how you got interested then in that aspect of book history and Canadian book history.
Yeah, well, I like another, I think, great part about living in Vancouver is that the Alcuin Society is sort of headquartered there. They're a national bibliophilic society, they call themselves. A group of people who are interested in books. And so it's a very wide-ranging set of interests that brings people in the Alcuin Society together. But they started in Vancouver. A lot of their early members were librarians at UBC. And so that gave me an opportunity to really get involved in that group a bit more. So I came across them at some point. I think during that period, I was like joining as many groups and associations as I could as a student to sort of like figure out the landscape.
Right.
But the Alcuin Society is very, very volunteer driven. It's not composed exclusively of academics. It brings together really interesting, people who are doing fine press work, fine press printers, book designers, both trade and fine press. People are interested in the history of the book, of course, and bibliography people. And they host events in Vancouver, like our annual Ways Goose, or they did before the pandemic. And then the other big thing is these book design awards that they run every year. So each year, publishers across Canada submit hundreds of books for consideration for the awards. And so, yeah, I joined the Alcuin Society, and it's been really wonderful for me as a place to kind of grow and continue my interest in rare books and special collections, and fine press printing as well. Even while like in my working career, I kind of stepped away from that as like my actual job, day-to-day work. So, yeah.
Let's show the items that you pulled for us, because I think the very first item is something that actually is from your own collection and tells you a bit of a story about your Vancouver life.
That's right. Yeah. So here, I'll switch over to the book here. So this is a copy of Bliss Carman's later poems. I was published by McClellan Stewart in 1921. And when I moved out to BC from New Brunswick, a really good family friend gave me a copy of this book, kind of like as I guess maybe a talisman or a good luck token, for moving out west. But if we open it up here, we can see the title page. We've got a nice picture of Bliss here.
Oh yeah.
Originally thought that this was signed, but in fact, this was a common thing to print signature, below the photograph. But it's a lovely, edition. And, it was really appropriate gift, I think, because Bliss Carman was born in Fredericton, he was from New Brunswick. He spent most of his time in the United States, but near the end of his life, he moved out to Vancouver. He found a new home there, I think, at the end, the latter years of his life, because in part, he had this really successful run of literary tours across Canada. And they often would end in Vancouver. There were a lot of people in Vancouver who really loved his work. And, his career had kind of flagged a bit through the 1910s.
Right.
And it was revived in the 20s due to these speaking tours. He was kind of reappraised at that period and kind of brought into the canon of Canadian literature at that time. And so, books like this too are a big part of that process, like anthologizing his works and reprinting them, collecting and reprinting them. And so, yeah, it was for me, bringing this out to Vancouver was a connection to my home, really. But I only found out later about Carman's connections to BC.
It's interesting when you look at the title page again, because it's sort of got that, when you look at kind of the ornate design, it kind of has a bit of a Kelmscott Press sort of feel to it as well.
Sure. Oh yeah, that's definitely what they were going for here.
Yes.
I wouldn't be surprised if this was a thorough McDonald.
Yes.
Got that kind of look, but I'd have to go into more detail and figure out, who did that. But it's a nice trade edition, but very like lovingly put together, I'd say.
We should point out you did not steal this from the Scarborough Library. There's definitely there, because I just saw a Scarborough Library stamp on it.
Yeah.
But it was also a discard.
Yeah, my family friend must have found this somewhere in New Brunswick. I don't know how it ended up there.
Right.
But it was a presentation copy to what used to be, the Scarborough College Library before it became part of the U of T system.
Right.
This guy's a judge. I guess his donation wasn't appreciated because you can see it was withdrawn. Scar withdrawn, which I think is also funny.
Ouch.
That's the stamp. Yeah. So yeah, this is my copy. I need to take it home tonight so it doesn't just get accidentally absorbed into the Fisher's collections.
So what else do you have for that? I think you have another poet.
Yeah.
Show us.
So, talking about Bliss Carman, he wasn't really the first Canadian author to find a home in Vancouver.
Mm-hmm.
I think arguably the first literary celebrity in the city was Tekawanake or Pauline Johnson,
mm-hmm.
Who's one of Canada's most famous, I think, performers and poets.
And she really was a celebrity. I mean,
she was a big
yes.
deal. Yeah. And it was interesting to me, like kind of the theme, I think, that's emerging here, and one that you sort of set up nicely, is kind of coast to coast connections.
Right.
We often think about Canada as collections of regions, right? And somebody, if they're from a particular place, it's like they're always from that place.
Right.
Whereas people move around a lot more. Despite the size of this country, and someone like Pauline Johnson, who is, comes from the Six Nations Reserve here in Ontario, as many people know, she was the daughter of a hereditary Mohawk chief
mm-hmm.
and a British mother, and made this, incredible career performing kind of both modes, so mm-hmm. she would don English dress for half of her performance and then switch into traditional Mohawk dress for the second, which, scandalized audiences, and they really loved that kind of like change in roles. So she had a really fascinating life. I mean, people have written wonderful biographies of her work, but to me, this sort of thing about the fact that she moved to British Columbia in Vancouver in 1908, and the reason why she did that was that it's going to switch back to me. So she ran into, or was, I guess, called to act as an interpreter for, or more correctly, Chief Joe Capilano in London, England, in 1906, because he was there as part of a delegation protesting restrictions on hunting and fishing that were placed by the Canadian government on coastal Indigenous peoples in BC. And so he's part of a larger group, came to air these grievances in front of Edward VII,
right,
King Edward VII. And so Pauline Johnson was in London at the time, and somehow this, I guess, group found out about her presence and was asked to kind of help, I guess, assist in this advocacy affair.
Right.
And so she met Capilano there, and I think they became fast friends. And as a result, she moved to BC a couple years later. And so the process of creating this book that eventually became Legends of Vancouver was about her listening to their stories. I think they would hang out, and he would tell her the stories of the Squamish people in BC. She became really, really close with the family.
Right.
And as part of that process, she kind of created her own versions of these stories. Like, she interpreted them within a very sort of like literary voice, I would say.
Right.
And serialized them in Vancouver newspapers. And what the thing that I think I really love about this story is that a group of citizens raised money to print this book because by 1911 she was sick with cancer. She was really ill and needed help to pay medical bills, right? So there wasn't assistance of that kind at the time. And this group collected these stories, which had been serialized before, published them as Legends in Vancouver, and sold them as part of a trust.
Right.
And so this is the first edition here. It's really quite fragile, so I want to be good with it. But if we go to the title page, we can see here it says privately printed, Vancouver, British Columbia, 1911. So this is the first edition. Privately printed was essentially representing the group that had put this together.
Right.
And it became a bestseller like overnight. Like this edition, I think was like 1,000 copies, sold out almost immediately. And they kept producing more and more editions with different, some illustrations. They sort of increased the content a little bit. They added some stories. And there's a really wonderful article by Linda Quirk about the publishing history of Legends of Vancouver.
Right.
Beautifully written and just really comprehensive as well. It's like a great combination. It's like what every bibliographical article should be really. It's like both moving and precise, which is what I love about it. But she estimates that they put out like 20,000 copies of this book. Like it was a true bestseller.
Yeah, and we have a number of different copies of the Legends of Vancouver in our collection. So since there's actually 2 on display right now in a temporary exhibition that we have.
That's right. Yeah, I mean, it's been in print since, like it's never gone out of print, which is rare for any Canadian book. But yeah, I mean, if the actual stories are fantastic to read as well, if you ever get a chance to sit down and actually read it, because it's a wonderful, wonderful book. And yeah, I just love that story. And she really set the stage, in my view, as sort of, I guess, for Vancouver to be a literary city. You know, she showed that, in fact, like literature could and did happen in that place, right? And there would be an audience for it. So I think she kind of set a precedent.
And then that sort of falls into some of the thesis work you did, isn't that right? With around the Vancouver Poetry Society?
Yeah, that's right. And so that's kind of what leads me to the next phase. So when I moved to Vancouver, I had arranged to rent a house over the phone, basically. Like I needed somewhere to live. And so, you know, was going through Craigslist listings and everything, and eventually found a place that seemed appropriate. It was near UBC. So I kind of like rented it sight unseen. I had some pictures, but you know, I'd never been there. And so when I showed up, I moved in. It was this beautiful arts and crafts home. Kind of would have been a huge single family house at some point, but it had been split up into apartments.
Right.
And I think it was about maybe a month or 2 after I'd moved in, I just Googled the street address, like randomly kind of wondering if anything would come up. And it did. It came up in a footnote in a book about Bliss Carman. So that immediately piqued my interest, right? I had that book on the mantle in this apartment. And it said in this footnote that Bliss Carman had found 2590 West 5th Avenue a haven during his time in Vancouver. And I was like, what?
Wait a minute, I live there.
Yeah, like this is where I live. But you know, street numbers change, right? Over time, sometimes cities will renumber homes. So I didn't quite know, but it made a reference to a woman named Kate Eastman, who had been a friend, and I think also a more than a friend for Bliss Carman during his times in Vancouver. And her records were at the UBC Archives and Special Collections. So I went out to UBC, opened up a folder, and there was a picture of Bliss Carman like at the house. He was like standing in front of what was then my kitchen window.
Wow.
It's wild. Yeah. This sort of thing doesn't happen all the time, right? And so as I started digging, you know, the house had been owned by a doctor named Ernest Fuster, who was also a poet, and he had organized this group called the Vancouver Poetry Society, which ran for very many years. It started in 1916, it ended in 1974, which is a very long time for any literary group to exist. And it had quite a like incredible life, really, as sort of a literary group. Many of the society's members were also part of this Theosophical Society. So they had that kind of like occult interest and combined it with poetry. So they produced a lot of like really wild, mystical kind of Victorian poetry. But the society also hosted all sorts of interesting people like Dorothy Livesey and Al Purdy, who brought more of a focus on literary modernism.
Both of you are right behind you, by the way, and photographs, both of them.
Which is, Al Purdy is right.
Yeah, there you go.
And so all the archives of that group are at the City of Vancouver Archives. So I spent basically like practically 2 years going into the City of Vancouver Archives and going through these records. And the thesis I ended up writing was about a really literary history of the Vancouver Poetry Society and trying to pull together the story of that group. Very few people had written about that group beforehand.
Mhm.
You know, they were considered sort of old-fashioned by the time the 50s and 60s rolled around. And so a lot of anything that had been written about at the time was kind of like, oh, they're just really, you
Right.
know, bad writers of bad romantic verse. But the story is much more complex than that. And of course, you know, like Bliss Carman, because he was coming to Vancouver during his literary tours, spent a lot of time there, right? I'll just move this aside very carefully. He spent a lot of time with the Fuster family. I think he lived at their house for sometimes like months at a time. And you know, this photo here, this is from Papers of the Fisher. This is from the Bliss Carman collection. This is a picture of him in British Columbia. It's probably hard to read, but on the back it says, "Our last picture of Bliss." This is taken just before his death in 1929.
Interesting.
But he's standing on some sort of mountainscape,
Right.
probably outside of Vancouver. And there are other photos that are in this Kate Eastman phone of him as well, with her and Ernest Fuster. They kind of had created a bit of a family unit, you might say.
Right.
But it was, I mean, there was materials in the archives that talk about Carman, you know, sitting around the hearth fire, and here in my apartment is the fireplace, you know, like.
Wow.
But the lasting effect was that I was able to write this thesis. I'd come to Vancouver wanting to, you know, write a master's thesis on Canadian literature, but had no real topic yet, you know. And suddenly this story was presented to me.
So let's can we look at some of the Vancouver Poetry Society material you brought out?
Yeah. So the thing that I've been focusing on more lately as a way of kind of bringing this research forward into, I think, maybe more of a bibliographical perspective is their publications. And so the really important one is this chapbook that was produced. I think it's a fascinating little document by itself, and there's a lot. I talked a little bit about it in my master's thesis, but ever since then I've been really trying to bring out more information about this publication.
Right.
It was put out in 1925, part of an intended series of chapbooks. They never got around to doing more. The work involves is way too much. Common situation in Canadian literary production, I think you would find.
Enthusiasm for the first one, and then meaning after that.
That's right. You can see this is the copy from the Fisher. It's inscribed to somebody named Charlie Ferguson with the artist compliments, J.E. And so J.E. is Janet Eves. She was a member of the Vancouver Poetry Society and connected to it via her husband. His name is Aubrey Goodall. So her married name was Aubrey Goodall, but as an artist, she always presented herself with her maiden name. They lived in Burnaby, which is a city outside of Vancouver. And at the time, it would have been pretty far away. So they, you know, traveled in to go to these society meetings and things like that. And I'll show just another item here to kind of set this up. So at a 1925 meeting, she passed around these chapbooks, which were produced by the Poetry Bookshop of London. In London, England, and designed by this guy named Claude Lovett Fraser, who's a celebrated book designer and illustrator. He died really young, just after the First World War. But he helped produce these beautiful chapbooks that are definitely like a throwback themselves, like very much in an arts and crafts kind of way, where they're reproducing the kind of look and feel of, you know, 17th, 18th century chapbooks, you know, cheap verses sold on the street, basically, right?
Right.
But they have these beautiful colored illustrations you can see that he made. I love this one in particular, although the poem's called Stupidity Street. It's entertaining. This is by a British poet named Ralph Hodgson. And so she came to this Vancouver Poetry Society meeting and passed these around, right? She had presumably visited London and maybe bought them herself. And said, we can do this, like we can do something that's like this, but for our poetry. And so that's what they did.
Bit ambitious though, in some ways, when you think about it.
Yeah, it really was. I think, I mean, in reading her correspondence about the production of this book, it was exhausting. Like,
Right.
I don't think she realized exactly what she was getting into. She produced 26 lino cuts for this book. It's called Three Poems. And if you kind of flip through, you can see they look very similar to the Lothar Fraser kind of look, right? It's very much an homage to that form.
Right.
But it includes 3 poems by society members. So this one's by Ernest Fuster, the president. There's another one by A.M. Stephen, and a third by a guy named Bromley Coleman. Some of them were hand colored, just like the Fraser example. So 50 of them they did watercolors for. So if I find one, I'd like to bring in collections because it's really beautiful. There's a few out there elsewhere in Canada. And she collaborated with this guy named Charles Bradbury. So that's this, you can see at the bottom here, published with the Vancouver Poetry Society by CB at the Sign of the Raven.
Right.
And so this Bradbury fellow is also an interesting character. He was sort of an amateur printer in Vancouver at the time. By day, he was a telegraph operator and possibly a photographer.
Okay.
But he clearly had an interest in printing. He had his own press of some kind. I'm not really sure what. And somehow Janet Eves had met him and brought him into the fold of the society to produce this work.
Right.
And you can see he's got a little like printer's emblem that she must have made for him at the back, which is quite nice. That's the Sign of the Raven, right? And so they worked together to produce this book. He had the typeset, for example, and printed it, and she did all these beautiful illustrations. And to me, like, this is a really early example of, two artists collaborating to produce a fine press book, really. I mean, it's a chapbook, but it's kind of an early example of that fine private press enterprise in Canada.
I'd suggest to you it's probably one of the earliest examples in all of Canada.
Yeah, I mean, which is kind of exciting, right? Interesting to see people starting to see books like this having potential as art objects, right? Or as aesthetic objects in addition to, if you look at other, like there are other chapbooks produced in Canada prior to this, but they don't have the same sort of aesthetic interest and kind of artistry about them. And, this is I think it's really charming and lovely. So something I'd like to continue working on is a bit more research into its production and who this Charles Bradbury guy was. And, if we can tell that story. I've been working with an Alcuin Society member, Chester Grisky, who is a great expert on fine and private press in Canada. And so he and I together have been pursuing this research. And so I think hopefully soon we'll be able to pull it together into an article or something like that.
Yeah, because I had put something of Charles Bradbury's in my exhibition almost 10 years ago now. And I think I wrote in the exhibition catalog, I virtually know nothing about this person. So, because I just couldn't find any information on him. So I think there's a lot there to be unpacked and uncovered.
That's right. Yeah, I think there's some interesting stories there. And even the story of Janet Eves, she was talking about struggling through illness and having to take care of their farm and, care for her kids at the same time as producing these illustrations and, the struggles of putting this book together. It's all really well documented in the Society archives, like her kind of her experience really of working on this. It's too bad she moved to England shortly thereafter. So I think that was another reason why they didn't continue the publication of these.
Right.
But it was really her hard work and initiative that created this beautiful little book.
Right. Do you have anything else to show us? I think maybe.
Yeah. Right. So one interesting kind of connection between this chapbook and another important moment in Canadian poetry history is the Ryerson series of chapbooks. It's not I haven't seen proof from the Ryerson side, but the Society archives say that the VPS chapbook was the inspiration for these Ryerson chapbooks.
Okay. Interesting.
That needs to be proven, but this Ryerson series was really long running, led by Lauren Pierce.
There's more than just one issue.
Yeah, there's hundreds.
Chapbook, yes.
And Eli McLaren has just published a really great book about this series of chapbooks. So I'd recommend you check that out. It's on my summer reading list for sure.
We might even actually, because Eli gave a Friends of Fisher lecture, and I think that lecture might actually be online on the Fisher site. So
oh, cool.
If it is, I'll put it in the show notes in the YouTube.
Yeah. He's done a lot of wonderful research about these poetry books. You can see the cover is kind of a similar aesthetic, right? As that Bliss Carman book. But this one's definitely by Thoreau MacDonald, who is the son of J.H. MacDonald, Group of Seven, but really wonderful illustrator in his own right. And I think we have his papers here at the Fisher too.
We have some of his papers. We also have a large collection of Thoreau MacDonald material because it was a personal interest of Richard Landon, the former director here.
Okay.
And actually Richard's book plate, if I'm not mistaken, was actually designed by Thoreau MacDonald.
Wow, cool.
So there you go. All these connections, Grant, you have to learn as time goes on.
Yeah, that's right. Well, I love this one in particular. It's by a VPS member named Annie Charlotte Dalton. And she has not really been subject to any sustained critical attention. Right. I think undeservedly so. But this particular book is called The Ear Trumpet. Throughout her life, she suffered from pretty severe deafness. Mm-hmm. And the book of poetry is really about that experience. And in particular, the first two poems counter what she sees as really derogatory depictions of deafness in modernist British literature. So she's responding to these British authors with her own kind of like fiery comebacks to their work. And so this first one is in response to a poem by Edith Sitwell. Mm-hmm. And unlike a lot of her other verse, which was much more kind of traditional and romantic in nature, this is quite jarring. It has a really modern feel. She was experimenting, I think, with modernist verse. And it had like, it's much different from anything else that she published, and really, I think, kind of cool. Like, she says, Edith Sitwell made a solo of her auntie, her rich auntie, and her trumpet. Such a trumpet as old ladies give to stranger folk to blow in. Down the trumpet, scornful Edith sang and chortled her fine solo of Judgment Day and a crack of doom, which is a reference to the original poem. And it goes on in this really like kind of clipped way. Right. Yeah, I think this chapbook's really different kind of view of her work. Mm-hmm. But she was a great admirer of modernist art and poetry. Right. Dorothy Livesey actually gave a eulogy at her funeral and wrote a poem in tribute to her. Okay. And Dalton herself was really interested in the work of the Group of Seven as well, particularly Lauren Harris. Oh, interesting. So, yeah, she's an interesting figure in Canadian literature. She also wrote a really cool kind of fantasy long poem called Flame and Adventure, which we do not have a copy of here at the Fisher. So I'll be on the lookout for that as the Canadiana Librarian.
Interesting. Maybe just go back to, we'll wrap this up, because one of the themes I'm noticing actually in some of the materials you picked for us here is the need for more discovery. And I'm just wondering if that's something that you've thought about. Obviously, you've only been in the job for a month, in terms of our Canadiana collections, which you're just learning, obviously, but maybe finding some of those areas that that are deficient at Fisher and filling those gaps. I mean, is that one of your is that sort of where your thinking is going in this position?
Definitely, yeah. I think really, you first have to understand the collection in order to identify its gaps. So that's my kind of first goal, is to really get a good handle on what's here. Right. But then, yes, I think telling more inclusive stories about Canadian literature, Canadian history, the Canadian experience of living in this place is a really, I think, important part of this role. Right. We're talking here about Canada Day. Canada Day can be a day of celebration for some, but not for others, right? Depends on your experience of this nation. Right. But the role of the Canadiana Librarian, I think, is to definitely like look outside of that national frame and start thinking about different sorts of communities that are in this country whose incredible cultural production deserves inclusion in these collections, right? And it'll only make the collections more, I think, true to life and more useful for people, right? Some of these stories here are just very tiny little examples of that, from different, different backgrounds and perspectives too. Certainly, like Pauline Johnson's is one of many Indigenous perspectives, I think, that could be really added to these collections. So it's an exciting opportunity. I think maybe hopefully you've gotten the sense that I just love following the trail, right? Like following these paths, right?
No, and the passion comes through as well.
Good.
Anyway, Grant, this has been really great. This is a great way to both introduce you to people that come to the Fisher, and to show us sort of your past as well, and where you're going to move forward with some of this, some of our collections. So we're very excited to have you on staff. As I said, this has been a great introduction. So thanks for being on the podcast. Thanks for your enthusiasm to be on the podcast. So as I said, this is the last one of season 2. If you want to see any of the past episodes, they're all on our YouTube channel. We have our own separate playlist called Between the Pillars. So if you've missed episodes and you want to catch up, they're all on there. You can see the depth and the breadth of our collections, and really the enthusiasm too of folks we've had on the podcast, talking about either their area of expertise, or our material and collections that they've used in their own research. And it's been fun for me anyway. So as I said, happy Canada Day. We will see everybody back in September. Have a great summer.
Thanks for having me.